Welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires, the show where we talk about finding strength when life falls apart. I'm your host, Melly, and around here, resilience isn't perfection. It's falling flat, getting back up, and maybe laughing about it later. From breakups to breakthroughs, we mix faith, neuroscience, and a little sass to help you rebuild a life that actually feels like yours. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Diamonds in Dumpster Fires. Today, I will be talking with author, family ministry leader, and homeschool mom, Christie Thomas, about her work on gentleness. We are going to get really practical about what this looks like in everyday moments, especially the hard ones. Her newest book, Everyday Prayers for Gentleness, is a 30-day devotional journal rooted in scripture and real-life application that reveals gentleness not as a weakness, but as spirit-empowered strength. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation, so let's get into it. Welcome, Christie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this. I think, for a lot of folks, gentleness has this connotation of like being not strong, kind of just a weakness in a way. And I'd love to hear your definition of gentleness as we kick this off.
Absolutely. So let's imagine that you have just given birth to a child and somebody places that baby in your arms and then they say to the baby, now be gentle with your mother. That sounds ridiculous, right? Ridiculous, right? Because the person that needs to have gentleness is the adult in this situation. It's the person with the strength. Gentleness does not come out of a place of weakness. It's actually an aspect of self-control where we hold back our strength for the sake of somebody else. So weakness is actually pretty much the opposite of gentleness. It doesn't come out of somebody who's weak. And we can think of that as Jesus too. And when we think about the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, every one of those describes Jesus. And if gentleness was weakness, then Jesus would have been weak. And he was definitely not.
Why do you think it is that when people hear the word gentleness, though, when we know these stories of Jesus and we see his strength, that they do associate it with weakness?
I think it's because we don't want to be gentle. It goes against our sinful nature. We don't want to lose. We don't want to give in. We don't want to be humble. There's a reason in the New Testament it tells us constantly, be humble, be gentle, be patient, because those are the things that we have a really hard time with. We don't naturally want to do that. So there's just something that rises up in our spirit. No, I don't want to be gentle because we think it's a weakness, but also because that's part of our sinfulness.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, what was the inspiration behind writing this devotional?
Well, I was approached to write it by the leader of Million Praying Moms, and she said, okay, the ones that we have left are kindness and gentleness. And I immediately thought, it's got to be gentleness, because to me, now maybe somebody needs to write the kindness book and change my mind on this, but to me, kindness is kind of fluffy. Like anybody can be kind. I know there's more to it than that, but that kind of was where my mind went originally. But I thought, gentleness, I need to dig into this more. I had previously written a family devotional called Fruitful 100 Family Experiences for Growing in the Fruit of the Spirit. And so I had done 10 devotions on each of the fruits. And the gentleness one was one of the ones that was the hardest, because I thought, what is gentleness? And that's when I started digging into gentleness and realizing it is not a weakness. It is strength. It is, strength under control. So it kind of started with that family devotional. And then I got to expand on it for this adult devotional.
What would you say is the role that prayer actually plays in growing in gentleness?
It's the only way we can grow in it, in my opinion.
Okay.
Because gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit, because it's not natural for us, and it's not about a meek personality trait, it's something that we have to grow by being in Christ. So he says, you cannot grow fruit apart from me. You have to abide in me. He is the vine and we are the branches. And he said, apart from me, you can bear no fruit. But with him, we can bear fruit. So prayer is part of that abiding process. We have to bring our struggles to God. There's always going to be times in our life when we think, I really don't want to be gentle right now. Or maybe we just weren't gentle in that moment at all. And then we need to take that to God in prayer and let him change us, because, like I said, it's a fruit of the Spirit. It's not about necessarily trying harder, although obviously we do have to practice it, but we can't grow it in just on our own strength. That's really not how fruit grows.
Right. What are some practical ways we can look at our lives and say, okay, I am growing in gentleness?
I think it's kind of a long process. I don't think we're going to see it like, I'm reading this everyday prayers for gentleness, and within a week I'm like, yeah, I'm rocking this gentleness thing. I think yeah, you kind of have to look back over your whole life. I remember several years ago, one of my boys said to me, Mom, I can really see you growing in patience. And I thought, at first I was like, ouch, like, obviously you've seen me as a very impatient person in the past. But over the years, I grew in patience. So I think if you were looking for specific indicators that you were growing in gentleness, it would be a lack of reactivity, because I think when we're not gentle, we're harsh and we're reactive. We jump right in right away with our outrage.
Mhm.
But when we're growing in gentleness, we are not so reactive. It is really paired tightly with patience. Like all those fruits of the spirit are connected together, right? So
Right.
gentleness is an aspect of self-control, and it's connected really deeply with patience and being willing to say, I don't need to jump right in here right away. I can pray about this first, or I can just kind of let this settle on my spirit for a while first.
Yeah, and I can see so many areas in life where this would come in handy. I'm thinking just, online and the way people kind of jump into conversations on there with a complete lack of gentleness, Christians included. What do you think it is for the church specifically that you hear sermons, about gentleness, but it is kind of that like meekness, mildness. Why do you think it is that the church sort of focuses on that aspect of gentleness as opposed to this strength under control?
I don't know. I've never actually heard a sermon on gentleness on either aspect of it. Maybe we just misunderstand it. I feel like there's a lot of people, though, that misunderstand Jesus. We want Jesus to be kind of in our image instead of making ourselves in his image instead. So we either want Jesus to be militant, he's a proponent of all of our, the angry things that we do and the ways that we lash out, or he's just this like wimpy guy who does nothing. But when we look at who Jesus is, for example, when he's about to be arrested, they come to him and he says, "Who are you looking for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am he." And they back up and they fall over. All the people who have come to arrest him literally fall on the ground because he has so much power that it just like blasts them over. And yet he chooses not to use that power. He says to his disciples, I've got legions of angels that could save me from this. But
Yeah.
he chooses not to because of his love. So maybe it's just we're not looking closely enough at who Jesus is. I'm not sure. I don't know. Do you
Yeah.
have any thoughts on that?
I think what you said makes total sense. And I know for folks listening to this podcast, a lot of them, are going through really, tough circumstances. We've got people going through divorces or job loss or all kinds of, what we call on here the dumpster fires of life. And so I think for folks, when they hear gentleness and they're in the midst of this like turmoil, it can feel a little bit maybe, not off putting, but like, how am I supposed to be gentle when, I've lost my job? How am I supposed to be gentle when my spouse says they don't love me anymore? What do you say to the person who is struggling with, some kind of big top tier dumpster fire of life? And they're like, well, I understand gentleness. I get it. It's a fruit of the spirit. But how am I supposed to be gentle in these times?
That's a really good question. I would say, first of all, 1 Peter 2:23 talks about how Jesus continued entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. So I think one thing that we can do is trust the God who judges justly. Trust that he is advocating for us and that he loves us and that we are not left alone to, I think part of the reason that we're ungentle is because we feel like nobody is advocating for us. Nobody's on our side. But the amazing God of the universe is on our side. He loves us and he is the one who judges justly. But then what he asks us to do is in Ephesians 4, it says that we are supposed to walk worthy of the calling that we've received with all humility and gentleness and with patience, bearing with one another in love. And I know that sounds really, like you said, it sounds off-putting when you're in the middle of one of those really hard situations, but it is a calling that we're supposed to do. So there's kind of the four things there: humility, gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love. And I think that when we're in those situations, we don't have any of those things.
Yeah.
We struggling with all of them. We don't have the humility and the gentleness and the patience and bearing with one another in love, but we can ask God for those things. So when we're asking God, oh God, I really hate this person right now. Honestly, please fill me with your love. Help me to see them through your eyes, even when I don't want to. You can pray for that humility that God calls us to, that maybe I don't have everything right. Maybe I'm not perfect in this situation. And that God can help me see the situation through somebody else's eyes. And so I think we were talking about that lack of reactivity. So one thing that we can pray is that God would just hold our tongues and hold our fingers so that we don't react, by typing things that we don't mean or that we do mean, but we probably shouldn't say, or say things that we shouldn't say. So we can ask God for all those things, for that humility, the gentleness, the patience, and the bearing with one another in love. And also give yourself gentleness. When you're in the middle of something that hard, I'm pretty sure that Jesus doesn't expect us to be 100% perfect on those things. He knows that we need help and that we fail and we succumb to temptation. And there's so much grace from him there. He's not like, oh man, you weren't gentle. I am done with you. No, he gives us another chance. He continues to want to walk alongside us and help us with that.
Now, how do you practice gentleness but still maintain boundaries? Let's just use the example of divorce, since that is the story a lot of folks listening will have. You're trying to practice gentleness. You are maybe pausing, not sending that text, not, making that phone call, but you also need to maintain boundaries for your own well-being. What does that look like? Because I feel like that can easily be confused where someone may feel, okay, I'm going to practice gentleness and then end up getting walked all over.
Oh, and that has happened to me before, for sure. It's definitely a learning process of remembering that gentleness is that two-sided coin. It's strength under control. So there has to be that strength there too. Otherwise, it's just weakness. And I know for some of us, that's a lot harder than other people. Some of us are going to lean toward the strength, and some of us are going to lean and it's going to look more like weakness. And it's hard to walk that line of the actual gentleness in the middle. I don't know that I have any real practical tips on that, just that we just got to keep leaning in and trusting that God is going to keep walking with us through those things.
Yeah. Like you said, we just got to keep staying in prayer, obviously. And it's probably a muscle that you have to grow over time.
Yeah, that's a good way to explain it. Yeah.
So I know for a lot of people listening, they're going to say, okay, yeah, but have you ever been in a situation where you need to react, this certain way, the anger is rising? Do you have a story where you had, you don't have to tell all the details, but maybe where you could have reacted one way and gentleness did kick in instead?
For sure. So several years ago, it was many years ago before I even had any kids. There was this lady at our church that did not like me at all. And I did not realize this. I think she actually has a personality disorder, like an actual mental illness, but I didn't know that at the time. So she had been assigned to our small group, and she called me and she was reaming me out for quite a while about how terrible I was because I talked so fast and she couldn't understand me. And she was yelling at me on the phone and I was just crying. My husband came in. He was like, what is going on? He just told her off and said, don't you ever talk to my wife like that again. And then he slammed the phone down. And so I was praying about it, and I knew I just had this feeling that I needed to apologize. And my husband was like, don't apologize. You've done nothing wrong. And this isn't always the right answer. Please don't take this as you should always apologize. I just felt in that situation that there was something that I needed to apologize for. And so the next time we were on the phone, because we were still assigned to the same small group, I started by apologizing. And I can't remember what exactly I said, probably just, I'm sorry I talk so fast or something like that. But what it did is it completely diffused her anger. And she started apologizing to me. And after that, it was kind of like a little love fest. And I was like, whoa, what is going on here? It was like this complete flipping of a coin. And so that's one example. I also want to give you an example from my son's life. So he had this kid he was in second or third grade. There was this kid in his class that was kind of his frenemy. He was always kind of picking on him, but then they try to be friends, but then the kid knew how to push his buttons. And so he wasn't a bully. He just wasn't nice. And actually one time he bit my son in the shoulder on the playground.
Oh, gosh.
It was pretty wild. But we were at Sunday school one day, and I think we were talking about kindness. And so I had asked the kids to create these little brown paper bags full of treats. And I said, I don't want you to just like give these to your mom or something. I want you to pray about, who does God want you to give this to? And my son came home and he said, I think God wants me to give this to Xander. And I thought,
Wow.
are you serious? And so we talked about it and we said, we kind of discerned that, like, is this something that God would do? Does God love his enemies? Yes, he does. Is this something we might see in the Bible? Somebody giving something away to an enemy? Yep. Yeah, we do. And so he did. He's told me he went to the playground and he kind of like threw it at the kid. He was like too scared to actually give it to him. And then a teacher picked it up and basically assumed that my son had been coerced into giving him the bag. And he said, no, 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 it's a gift. But in a very interesting turn of events, this kid actually completely stopped bothering my son after this.
Wow.
Super unexpected. Wasn't what we were planning on. My son was just obedient to what he felt God wanted him to do. And the gentleness just diffused the situation, which was unexpected.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Now, speaking of kids, I know you are a family ministry leader, so I'd love to dive a little bit into gentleness when it comes to parenting. How does gentleness shape the way that kids specifically experience faith?
Oh, that's a good question. You mean like our gentleness or God's gentleness?
In teaching them about gentleness, and like this story of your son's a great example that he actually was able to experience showing gentleness to someone else, and like how can we maybe teach kids to be able to experience their faith in that way, that physical manifestation of it, and being gentleness to others?
I think it really starts with pointing them to who Jesus is. I think for all of these things, we have to point them at Jesus. I find the fruit of the Spirit is a really tricky thing to teach kids because it's either very metaphorical, like peace is like a peach, which makes no sense to a kid, or we lean really hard on legalism and try hard faith. Like, okay, we're going to practice being gentle now. Okay, this is what it looks like, and we're just going to practice it. And we miss the fact that it's a fruit of the Spirit. So that's the reason that I want them to go to Jesus, because how does Jesus show gentleness? And who is Jesus? Jesus is both the Lion of Judah and he's the lamb that was slain at the same time. There's never a moment in his life here on earth when he was not the Lion of Judah. And yet he did not roar at people.
Right.
Well, there were a couple times that he roared at people, but that was in his godly anger that we have a really hard time accessing. And because our human anger does not produce the kind of righteousness that God desires, as it says in James.
Right.
So I think, yeah, for kids, it's a lot about pointing them to Jesus. So how does he do this? And then asking him to work in us in that.
And what would you say is one maybe small shift that a parent could make this week if they wanted to move toward gentleness in how they react to their children?
That's a big one too. One small shift, I would say take a breath and pray before you jump in. For me, that's been a big thing. I really hate it when my kids fight. I'm like a peace lover. I really just don't like conflict. And so I used to always jump in when my kids were fighting. And I realized I'm actually not really doing them any favors by always jumping in and stopping the fight. So I've learned, I'm not always perfect at this, let's be clear, to just stop and pray, God, help me with this, help me to deal with this wisely. And then I can jump in without shouting and yelling and making it all worse. Because, our tendency is, our kids are doing something bad and we come in and we're like, stop doing that. This is terrible. You're an awful person. And we, react out of our own humanness. But basically, we're treating them like we don't want them to treat others. So if we can practice that little breath, the little breath prayer, and it could be very short, like, God help me. And then, again, it comes down to that reactivity thing. So practicing being less reactive.
Yeah,
That helps a lot.
definitely. And that is so difficult in all areas of life, whether it's parenting, at work, just even scrolling social media. I think not reacting to things in the moment when you're keyed up about it can be so difficult. And yet it is such a key skill to develop.
It is, unfortunately. It's too bad that most of us don't do it very well.
Yeah. Now, do you ever get people when you tell them about gentleness that are like, okay, but Jesus flipped over the tables?
Yes, I do. Because that's the first thing that comes to people's mind. Well, Jesus flipped over the tables. Okay, so the definition that I think is accurate of gentleness is strength under control for the sake of someone vulnerable. And I think that fits in that situation as well. So Jesus had strength and he had the right to go in there and do a lot more than he actually did. But he took the time in the book, I think it's the Gospel of John, it says he took the time to weave a whip. He was probably praying while he was doing that. And then he gets in there. And who is he targeting? Is he targeting the foreigner? Is he targeting the women or the children? Is he whipping people? No, it never says that he whips people. It says that he flips the tables because they are targeting the foreigners and the poor. And so he flips their tables, he releases the birds, he whips the animals out. I know there's a lot of Renaissance art that shows him like angry with the whip, and there's children and women running away. Like, that's not the Jesus that we see in the Gospels. You read through the Gospels, you tell me any indication of Jesus being the kind of person who would whip a child. There's
Right.
absolutely not any evidence for that in Scripture. So I think that actually what he was doing there was still an aspect of gentleness, because he was still withholding power. He could have done a lot worse, and he was doing it to fight for the vulnerable, because it was the foreigners that were being taken advantage of by the money changers, and the poor that were being taken advantage of by these overinflated prices for the doves specifically. And that's one of the things it says. It says that he releases the doves, and because that they were targeting the poor.
Right. That definitely rings true. Now, do you think that some people avoid working on becoming more gentle because it requires a lot of emotional maturity that maybe hasn't been fully formed?
Oh, probably. Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's not something that we want to do in our humanness. We want to fire shots at anyone with an opposing view. We don't want to look weak, because honestly, gentleness does sometimes look weak. And that's probably why we think gentleness is weakness, because it might look weak to us. Like Jesus talks about turning the other cheek. That looks like weakness, but it's withholding your power. It's keeping it under control. It is actually an aspect of gentleness. It's not weakness. A weak person would crumple to the ground and not have that kind of self-control to turn the other cheek.
Right. Yeah. If you think about it like that, that is the ultimate strength because, yeah, a weak person would just crumble, but a strong person is like, okay, turning the other cheek. Like that is actually really strong if you think about it in that sense.
Sure is. Can I give you an example of something that I just heard? This Wednesday morning, I was in my prayer group, and they were talking about this man from Nigeria who he's a seminary leader. He actually he came to Christ when he was 17, and he didn't even know how to read, and he wanted to read the Bible. So he enrolled himself in primary school and started to read so he could read the Bible. And he ended up going to seminary, and now he's like the leader of the biggest seminary in Nigeria. But Nigeria has a lot of persecution of Christians. There's a lot of like the Fulani militants there. They're like the Muslim militants are very militant, and they're very violent. And so there's a lot of violent persecution against Christians in Nigeria, lots of killings. And so he wrote a book called No More Cheeks to Turn. And it's about this idea of turning the other cheek, and how do you live with your enemies always persecuting you. And so he's had firsthand experience of people in his life who have been killed because they were Christians. And so they were telling us about this fellow at the prayer meeting, and they said a month ago they had this, they had met with him and a whole bunch of other Christian leaders from Africa, and it was so amazing. And then they got word that he'd been kidnapped by the militants. And so of course they're praying for him like crazy. And 4 days later he was released, and he comes out and he's like, these guys are so broken and so hurt and so desperate that they felt like they needed to kidnap me. So here he is,
Wow.
literally kidnapped, and still turning the other cheek and offering gentleness to those who literally kidnapped him so that they could ransom him. And I thought, wow, like if he can do that, I probably can too, with God's help.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's quite a story. What was the name of his book again?
No More Cheeks to Turn. I found it on Amazon. He has a whole bunch of books actually.
Okay, great. We'll put that link in the show notes as well then for folks to check out. That sounds really interesting.
Mhm.
Now, I'd love to, if you wouldn't mind telling us which day from your devotional is your most, favorite or one that you enjoyed writing the most and explain why.
So normally I write for children, and I really enjoy kind of having a little bit of a silliness. So if you go to day 13, that you get a little bit of my silliness in there, and I really enjoyed writing that one. So it's about pursuing gentleness, and I talk about how at my childhood grocery store there used to be teenage boys that would ride around on roller skates. So when they needed something, they would just, groceries aisle 9, or, whatever it is. Oreo cookies aisle 9. The guys on the roller skates would go and get the cookies and then come back. And I thought that was so super cool. So I was thinking, like, wouldn't it be great if we could access the fruit of the spirit like that? I imagine myself standing in line at the grocery store, struggling to be gentle with my hungry, whining child, and the cashier calls over a roller skating guy. Get this lady some gentleness from aisle 9. Stat! And he'd zip through the store, grab some gentleness, hand it over, and voila, I'd be a gentle person.
Love that.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, but would be fun.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun. And yes, it is too bad that we can't just access things like that. Yeah, I'd like a little bit more. It's funny because I feel like today, in today's world, especially with like AI and everything's like right at our fingertips, having to work on something like gentleness or really any of the fruits of the spirit is going to be, I hope it doesn't become a lost art, but it almost feels like it is because we want things right away. It's like even, my pastor a couple weeks ago on Sunday was talking about how it's, people nowadays can just, they're like, what does, Colossians chapter 1 mean? Type it into AI. It's like they haven't done the actual work of
Mm.
knowing where to look and do a word study. And we lose something when we just quickly grab hold of things, right? So it's interesting. It's like God has built in for us this ability to like, we have to, there's no, quick fix for gentleness or patience. I think patience, like you mentioned, goes kind of hand in hand with gentleness. That one is really, really tough. For me, I know I'm like somebody who's like, okay, I have an idea. I want it done now or like yesterday. How do you think for folks who are struggling and going through these difficult times, we talk about gentleness, but how do they also grow in patience at the same time?
You know what? So I did a session last year for our homeschool conference, and it was about becoming a slow to anger parent. And one of the things we talked about was just knowing your triggers. And so if you know that there is something or someone that is constantly getting to you and you are just, it's impossible for you to react in gentleness on that, that's the kind of thing that it's time to work on. So you can do two things with a trigger. You can design your life around it. So for example, something that would cause me to be impatient or ungentle is when my kids are making me late for something. And then I would yell at them and or back the van out of the garage too fast and bash the garage door in, which I did twice. And like had to fix my van and my garage door twice because I was so impatient and so ungentle. So I had to realize like I have to design around this thing that is causing me to be so impatient and so ungentle. So I just intentionally give myself more buffer time. Like you would think that would be pretty obvious, but I wasn't doing it. Giving myself more buffer time when I knew we needed to go somewhere. And so I don't experience that level of frustration anymore because I've worked to create that buffer time. Sometimes you can't design around your trigger. Like your trigger is just there all the time. Like it's a person who whines or it's your ex or something, and you just can't avoid them. And that's when we really, really have to dig deep in prayer and God, I just desperately need your help with this. And he is faithful for that. God doesn't say, oh, you're asking for patience and for help from me. I'm busy today. He wants us to ask for those things. Those are the kind of prayers he loves to answer.
Yes, absolutely. But I do feel like in my life, I have asked God to build patience in me. And so I've had to struggle through some things where I want an answer now. I want this to happen. I'm like, come on, God, can't we just do this now? And it's like, no, you wanted patience.
You know what drives me most crazy about that is that, oh my God, I asked for patience, not the opportunities to learn patience.
Yeah, definitely. So if someone listening is thinking, okay, this all sounds great. I want this. I want more gentleness in my life, but I don't know how to start. Like, I don't know where to go to become more gentle. Where do they start?
Well, I could point you to my book, but also I would point you to the Bible, to looking at who God is towards you. It's hard to grow in gentleness if you don't know who God is. And so actually the first several devotions in my book are all about God's gentleness toward us. There's a proverb that says that a gentle answer turns away wrath. And Jesus fulfills that proverb because he is the gentle answer that turns away the justified wrath of God. And so when we know how gentle God is toward us, he is not harsh with us. Yes, I mean, there's consequences for our actions, but he's not harsh with us. He withholds his power all the time for the sake of us who are vulnerable. And he shows us his deep, unfailing love. So when we really dig deep into who our God is toward us and how much he loves us and how gentle he is toward us, then we're going to start to have a thirst for our own gentleness, I think. So we're not going to start by saying, oh, I guess I have to be more gentle, but we're going to start by looking at God and seeing his gentleness toward us.
Yeah, I love that. So, yeah, in thinking about that, learning how we too can, sure, you might be able to send that text and you might get the best of someone with a sharp word, but restraining that for the sake of the person on the other end of that is a strength. And so, viewing it as a strength, I think, is something that's different for a lot of folks to think about. I wish a lot of people online would think about that before they left comments.
And it's not just about holding back that sharp word for the sake of the person on the other end, but for your own sake too. Because when we engage in those kind of fights online or in person, it does not do our hearts any good. It does
No.
not bring peace. It does not bring joy. So think of it as a gift to yourself too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, because I think for a lot of folks, they're like, oh, well, I can't let anyone get the best of me. And it's this sense of they want to be in control because that's how they feel safe.
Hmm.
So, in the way that we're talking about gentleness, it's not that you're giving up your strength, but you are protecting yourself and others from maybe the consequences of just going out there and blasting a word that you shouldn't say. But what do you say for the person who's like, that feels really risky. Like, I can't be that. Maybe they're going through the divorce and it's like, oh, you don't know how my ex talks to me. Like, I have to be ready with a word back for them or,
It is risky, and trusting God is a huge risk. I totally get that. And I'm not going to get out there and say, you should do this all the time. I just know that I would encourage you just to talk to God about that and try to trust in that leading. I just know that when I've lashed back, it has never turned out well
yeah.
for me or for the relationship at all. It has not been a positive, like a net positive in any way. So some of that might just come down to learning to trust that God is going to advocate on your behalf and that you don't need to fight for your rights because God does. Although that's tricky though, because I know that there are situations with abuse and stuff. So it's kind of, I can't really give a blanket answer to that. But I think that God knows in your situation what would be the best thing for you
Yeah,
and for your
absolutely.
heart and for your situation, right? So you need to lean into him and try to follow his guidance on that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, of course, for those who are going through something, definitely talk to a professional. We're not saying that, you always have to just not speak up for yourself. Certainly
Right.
not.
Yeah.
But I will give an example even in my own life. It was after my divorce had finalized and my ex-husband sent me an email. He was asking a question and it was worded really poorly. And I typed out my response, and I was like, haha, and then I sat there and I thought, what is he really asking me right now? He's obviously worried about something. Could he have approached it better? Absolutely. Do I need to respond the way I'm writing? No. So I deleted what I had written, just responded to basically, he just needed some information from me, which I could provide. So I provided that for him. And then he actually ended up, saying, okay, thanks. Like it didn't escalate any further
Mhm.
than it needed to. So in
Mhm.
that way, that was helpful. But if somebody is being abusive to someone online, what is the way that they can respond with strength, but also with gentleness? Like I get comments sometimes on my social media. I had a post where I was talking about the health benefits of prayer in addition to obviously, I mean, I'm a Christian. I always, the number one benefit of prayer is we get to commune with our creator, but there's also documented health benefits too. And I like to share when science and faith converge. And I had a guy leave a comment and I ended up just deleting it and ignoring him, but he said, "It's nice to know you'll be in hell." And I was like,
What?
yeah, he said, "You heathens have no idea what you're talking about." And I'm like, what is he? I mean, that could have just been a loon, right? Like, I don't even know.
I have definitely gotten comments like that too because I talk about family discipleship. So I've gotten you shouldn't stop indoctrinating your kids, stop brainwashing your kids, or just some really weird comments on my YouTube channel. And sometimes I'll type something out, and like you with your ex-husband, I'll be like, okay, that was actually not really helpful. So I will delete it before I send it. But sometimes if I really pray through it, I feel like there often is a way to respond that often puts people off their guard. Like I've often had it where I've kind of responded respectfully and even out of curiosity, like, why are you saying something like this? Like, this is, you're putting something on me that I don't believe is true. And then people will often come back and be like, oh, yeah, like, I'm sorry, I thought that you were something else. Because we all react, right? And so I feel like if even one person can see a Christian who is not being reactive and going, oh, well, maybe not all Christians are like that, then I think that's a good thing for the kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what would you say is like the one takeaway that you would want listeners to leave this episode remembering?
Okay, this comes out from some conversations that I was having last week. I spent a week with some people from Voice of the Martyrs, which is pretty fantastic. They're people that work with the persecuted church. And somebody asked them, what do you think is the biggest problem with North American Christianity? And one of them said, we forgot who our true enemy is. And so I think that's one thing I'd like you to remember who the real enemy is. The real enemy is not flesh and blood. It's the spiritual powers of this dark age. Like, look in Ephesians for the actual, it's Ephesians 6 for the actual quote. But our true enemy is not our exes. Our true enemy is not that person on social media. It's not our child. It's not our mother-in-law. It goes way deeper than that. And so if we can remember who our true enemy is, then it becomes a lot easier to respond in gentleness, remembering that the other person is also created in the image of God.
Love that. Thank you so much for being here today, Christie. This conversation has been great. I know it's going to really bless a lot of listeners.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated it.
And listeners, if you want to connect with Christie or grab her book, we will have everything linked in the show notes below. And if this conversation encouraged you today, could you send it to a friend? Because chances are, if it encouraged you, they are navigating some of these same moments too, and it could encourage them as well. Thank you so much for being here, Resilient Ones, and we'll see you next time. Bye. Thanks for listening to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. If today reminded you that resilience is a practice, not a personality trait, you're in the right place. Keep showing up, keep rebuilding, and don't forget, even diamonds start as pressure and mess. For more faith-filled encouragement and real-life tools to help you heal and grow, check out the show notes for some free resources and ways to stay connected. See you next time.